to seize Taiwan will not be easy. We can look back to D-Day and the crossing the Channel, where Taiwan is a lot further away from the China than France was from the UK. There are other islands that make up the Taiwanese, nation state, if you like, which China could seize. But to try and take Taiwan militarily will not be easy. And China does not have strong operational campaign experience.
Firstly, Tim, can I just get your reaction on the record of 103 warplanes sent near Taiwan by China?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something that's been going on for a long time. China are pushing into Taiwan airspace. They're also pushing into the shipping, maritime lanes, and so forth. They're maintaining this pressure. But there's undoubtedly a danger to this. We saw that incident recently in Ukraine in the Black Sea with a Russian fighters looking as though, in fact, firing a rocket to potentially shoot down a UK aircraft. A lot of these conflicts start with accidents, and when you push this hard, there are dangers, real dangers, to something going wrong. So we shouldn't underplay it. It is nonetheless part of a long-running issue of China pushing into airspace, pushing into maritime space, and saying to Taiwan, we are not going away. And we know publicly China has declared that they want Taiwan back in, and there are those who argue they want it in by the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is not going to change, in my view. That we will continue to see these sorts of incidents happening.
And China now has the world's biggest navy. I mean, is it time for the US and its allies to invest more in its military?
Well, I spent 43 years in the military, so you wouldn't expect me to say it's not a bad idea. However, having said that, there is a debate going on, and there have been one or two very good pieces recently. Rob Fry, who's a retired three-star UK Royal Marine, wrote a very good piece in the article the other day about UK defence policy, and laid that out in the context of history, talked about whether this was a 1911 moment. We traditionally, the UK, for example, have been a maritime nation. There have been times when we've had strong land forces, but if you go back to the Napoleonic era and things like Waterloo, which Rob talks about, we basically commanded a very multinational European force. We were a minority player in the Battle of Waterloo, and we were, basically those most people would argue we were saved by the Germans arriving at the appropriate time. So we are reflecting on this, and we've seen over the last few years in the UK how the government under Ben Wallace and others have reduced the size of the army and have invested in 2 new carriers, and are investing in astute submarines, and obviously renewing our nuclear deterrent, and also investing in frigates, Type 35 frigates, and other things. The US have been doing much the same. So it's not about just the UK's maritime strategy. It's about an international maritime strategy, because nobody is going to be able to stand up on their own against China. I don't think even America would want to do that. So they want to work with us. They want to work with the Australians, who of course have done the deal recently over submarines and are increasing their defense spending. The Americans, of course, spend a huge amount of money on defense. I can't see us spending a large amount of new money on defense. We've just seen the figures in the last few days of the amount of money we've just borrowed. We now have debt of over 2 trillion, which is extraordinary, really. So we do want to sustain, and we need to think about how we use our current defense spending. And I think the move to a maritime strategy historically is where we've been, and I happen to believe, even though I'm an army guy, that that's the right thing to do.
But you mentioned Ben Wallace there, and now Grant Shapps is his successor. And, through AUKUS, Britain could end up on another front. And we may very well have Ukraine and Taiwan kind of heating up at a similar time. Is Grant Shapps, with his lack of military experience, really the right man to lead in that sort of scenario?
Well, his appointment was a surprise to me, if I'm honest. There were others that I thought probably. I should say straight up that I was disappointed that Ben Wallace left. I knew he was talking about he decided to stand down as an MP, But I had hoped he would stay on as defense secretary through to the election, which probably won't happen till around this time next year, I would think. I don't think the government are going to rush to the polls too quickly. So the appointment of a new defense secretary was a shame in the context of this. And there's no point in pretending that Grant Shapps has got lots of defense experience. He hasn't. I mean, he's had 5 senior appointments over the last 4 or 5 years. I think he's had about 3 or 4 in the last 12 months. And the bottom line is, without being unfair or being clever about it, I don't suppose he's going to be defense secretary for very long, because, you know, the chances of a change in government is pretty high. So, you know, what will he do? Well, if he's got any, well, common sense in inverted commas, he will get in. He's now in the MOD. He'll be briefed, and he would, I would think, would want to pick up where Ben was and where Ben was trying to take defense and run with it. Now, your point about Ukraine, potentially Taiwan, I've mentioned beforehand the Nagorno-Karabakh situation with Armenia and so on. This is part of the problem with defense. There are lots of people who sit down and say, well, you know, we don't need a lot of money in defense because the world is much more stable, et cetera, et cetera. And there are, at the other end of the spectrum, there are those who think we're all going to be dead by Friday. You know, neither of those two extremes are very helpful. But the reality is, war comes unexpectedly from all sorts of directions. The government have talked about a pivot to the east, or a leaning to the east. We know that from a NATO point of view, the UK is very important for its maritime strategy in the Atlantic and maintaining those lines of communication. So, you know, notwithstanding global Britain, whatever that may or may not have meant, you know, we can't be everywhere. So I do think that China is a long-term strategic threat. I think I've said to you before that, you know, the maxim that Russia is bad weather, China is long-term climate change in terms of the threats. I think that's right. And I think the Americans certainly strongly believe that. And the Australians certainly, you know, see that as a problem, as do many of the Pacific nations. So our relationships with Japan, of course, is talking about joining our next 5th generation fighter program, and other things that are going on. So if we want to be strong, we can't be strong everywhere. And we have to decide what it is where we think our major play should be. We're not going to withdraw from Europe, as in withdrawing from NATO in the European field, but Poland is rearming, spending a lot of money on defense. Other nations in the European mainland are spending more on defense. Germany, in theory, is spending more on defense. So, you know, my instinct is we can say, if it's a land battle we're talking about, then it's the European mainland that's going to have to take that on. Our role is to sustain a maritime capability, and recognize that we could end up with 2 or 3 wars running at the same time. That's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Just returning back to China and Taiwan quickly, does these warplanes that were sent near Taiwan, we've seen China really bolstering its air power and its navy. Is this signaling a ramping up of tensions, or is this just kind of what every day, I guess, is like?
Well, it's a ramping up of tensions in the fact that China does want to keep the pressure on Taiwan. But like all these debates, we have to keep a strategic perspective. China has engaged in land warfare with India over the boundary issues and so forth. And, you know, they've conducted some other operations, but not much. And to seize Taiwan will not be easy. You know, we can look back to D-Day and the crossing the Channel, where Taiwan is a lot further away from the China than France was from the UK. There are other islands that make up the Taiwanese, nation state, if you like, which China could seize. But to try and take Taiwan militarily will not be easy. And China does not have strong operational campaign experience. And its senior leadership, these things, you know, they're easy to talk about. They're easy to do exercise, what we call CPXs, headquarter exercises and so forth, and map exercises and so on. But to actually move against Taiwan militarily will not be easy. So what they want to do, and I think they will continue to put the pressure on Taiwan, is to try to convince Taiwan that they're not going to succeed in holding out. And of course, there are some fantastic philosophers, Chinese particularly people like Sun Tzu and Lao Tzu and others, who say that the greatest military victory is one that is achieved by not having to fight. And if you understand the enemy and understand yourself, you need not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles, and so on. All of that stuff in The Art of War, which is, still a good read when it comes to these sort of conversations. So China's pressure is as much as anything to convince Taiwan not to resist coming back into the fold, if you like. Now, I don't think Taiwan will go for that. And I think America will continue, and we will continue to support Taiwan as an independent nation. But the indications in the UN and, in places like Africa, and the relationships that China has now around the world, the balance of power that's changing economically as well as militarily, these things will all over time have an impact. So in the conversations today, I can be fairly sanguine about it, and I am, is the truth, but that could change relatively quickly, and we need to keep a track of what's going on here.
If China does attempt to do this and does attempt to take Taiwan, do you think it'll be an invasion or a blockade?
Well, you don't take Taiwan just through a blockade. You have to, if you want to force Taiwan into the fold, you have to take Taiwan. Now, a blockade obviously will have an important impact. I think it would be an air campaign and a long-range missile campaign. You can do an awful lot of damage without having to land troops on the ground. And there are only I think there's about 5 suitable landing areas in Taiwan where you can, sort of D-Day type landings, if you like. And the Taiwanese know that, and they're pretty well defended. The interesting one is the blockade. What would the Americans, what would the West do if China tried to blockade Taiwan? How would they do that? Would they close the straits and so forth? And that's, again, so a maritime and air campaign is possible that would flow from that rather than a land campaign. So, and I don't think, America obviously has troops in places like Korea as a result of the Korean War, but I don't see America landing huge numbers of American forces on Taiwan. It will be a maritime and air campaign that they would fight. And I think ultimately they would win, if I'm honest. So blockade, yes, but how to do that? How would you run that campaign, and what would you do once others start pushing against it and demanding access to international maritime sea passage through international waters, which the Americans would push, I think, and we probably would too. Actually, we've done it before, and China's complained about it. But ultimately, this is why these islands are not unimportant in this debate. I know they don't relate to Taiwan directly, but dumping sand, building islands, and creating your own sovereign space in the South China Sea, I'm amazed that they've got away with it. I can remember actually being involved in a conversation between Qatar and Bahrain, where they were accusing, I think the Qataris in particular were accusing Bahrain of building up sand islands so that at low water, they were claiming it as Bahraini territory, and it was important because of all the gas and oil fields around there. And China's trying to do the same thing. So we have to push back at this. We can't just sit back and allow China to get away with what it is that they're intending to do.
And the Pentagon has hinted that a potential blockade would actually maybe prove better for Taiwan because it could allow Taiwan's allies to mobilize resources for the islands, and it might harden international resolve against Beijing.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. Like all these things, there are various options, various plans. One of the great military maxims of the 3 plans that you have, it's always the 4th that happens. So you need to be careful about it, just assuming that that's what come out of it. We look at Ukraine now, and it's been going on for quite a while, and the resolution for the West, and Poland is talking about not sending more equipment to Ukraine, partly because they're beginning to run out themselves, and they're trying to rearm themselves and are worried about their own sovereign state and protection and so on. So yes, I think that is certainly, I would hope that would certainly happen, that the UN would speak out against it, and that the other nations would rally around, Australia in particular, but other Pacific nations, and indeed other nations elsewhere, like Africa. But I don't think we can just assume that. I think there's a real issue going on here in terms of where we stand, in terms of our values as we understand them, however you define those: Western democracy, liberalism, capitalism, freedom of speech, freedom of the media, and all of that stuff, and what's happening in places like China and Russia and Iran and elsewhere, lots of other places. So we can't just assume that would happen. I think I would hope that it would. The big question is how long would that resolution hold firm? And as we know, the old maxim, somebody asked the Chinaman what they thought about the French Revolution, and he said, give me a couple of 100 years and I'll tell you. They think very long term. They think very strategically. So for them to put some sort of blockade in place, they're not going to, they would hold that for 10, 15, 20 years if necessary. And the question is, would we be prepared to be that resilient as well? And my concern is we probably wouldn't be. That's the truth.
You mentioned Ukraine there, and it's very surprising that China wouldn't see the reaction that the West and the international community has had to Russia invading Ukraine, becoming a pariah, and kind of deciding to follow suit. I mean, why hasn't China taken those lessons from what Russia's done?
I think they have. I think they don't want Russia to lose, and they've been prepared to provide support in all sorts of ways. But I think they will have learned the lesson. And in a way, it goes back to my earlier point. Everybody expected that Russia, in the early days, would establish, maneuver warfare, surround Kyiv, take the capital, secure quite a lot of the land in the east pretty quickly, and move west. I mean, ultimately, that's what the Russian objective was. Of course, it wasn't just about grabbing a couple of provinces in the east. It was about taking the whole country, including Odessa, and so on. So China will have watched that, and I think they would have thought, like most people in the West, most commentators would have said it was going to be over pretty quickly. What's happened is that hasn't happened. So what lessons do you get from that in 21st century warfare? Clearly, drones, AI, space, digital, these other domains, not just in the land, sea, and air domain, but we now have these other domains which are proving to be crucially important, satellites, and all the things that flow from that. So China will have learned those lessons. They'll have also learned that, the air campaign is pretty crucial. One of the problems for Ukraine, undoubtedly, is it's been unable to secure air supremacy over the whole of the area, and not even air superiority in most cases. So it's not fighting an air campaign in the way that we would, have understood it. It's using drones and missiles and so forth, as indeed are the Russians. So the attritional fight that developed as a result of Russia's failure in the east, in particular, has caused a lot of casualties, and holding defenses has always been. Again, the maxim is you need a sort of 3-to-1 advantage to secure territory. If you're the attacker, you need about a 3-to-1 advantage over the defender. So again, from a China point of view, when it looks at Taiwan, its ability to hold land, hold ground, and what's the effort it's going to take to move across that space in order to land in Taiwan and conduct operations, what Ukraine is showing is that this is jolly difficult. And the key issue, again, Sun Tzu and others talk about this. The three components of a military capability, the three components are the physical stuff, the tanks, the aeroplanes, the armored vehicles, and indeed the logistics to support it. The conceptual stuff, the thinking behind how to use that stuff. But the key component is the moral component of fighting power. And what the Ukrainians have displayed is that their moral component is vastly superior to the Russian. And in a China-Taiwan situation, don't underestimate the moral component from a Taiwanese point of view. And the Chinese, President Xi and others talk up the fact that they want China to come, be back to what it was, and Western imperialism, back at the beginning of the 20th century and so forth. But for the average Chinese soldier, that's going to mean absolutely nothing. So that moral component piece is a key issue in this too. So what the lessons we're learning from Ukraine, all of us are learning, is that the new domains are important. The balance between mass and technical capability, however you want to define that, and the air business, I think is lessons that China will be learning. They're not daft. I mean, they may not have fought many wars recently, but they're not daft.
And I mean, you were drawing some similarities there between Ukrainian troops and Taiwanese troops, and the morale to fight, the will to fight, which we've seen how important that has been for Ukraine. Would you draw similarities between the Chinese troops and the Russian troops, where we've seen the Russian troops have very low morale, and just not really have the will to fight. They've kind of been forced out there. Could we see the same thing with the Chinese troops?
Yes, we could potentially. I mean, you used the expression "the will to fight," and that's exactly what the moral component is. It's a preparedness to die on the battlefield in order to secure a victory. And that's, it's easy to talk about this stuff, but don't underestimate in the Second World War. But there's all sorts of statistics that flow around, but one of them is there was 1 million rounds of small arms fired for every casualty in World War II. 1 million rounds. Why is that? Because an awful lot of soldiers never actually pointed their rifle at somebody to kill them. They fired in the air. They didn't want to fight and all the rest of it. But there was nonetheless an underpinning in World War II that we needed to defeat Nazism, etc., etc. So that this moral component, the will to fight, the preparedness to die, is very important. But ultimately, too, its foundation is embedded in leadership, and the Russian leadership has been very poor. The Russians don't have the equivalent of a professional senior NCO cadre like we do. The strength of the British Army has always laid in the Sergeant's mess, the warrant officers and Sergeant's mess. These guys are experienced guys. They've come in as private soldiers. They've been promoted over the years, and after about 15 years or so, they enter the Sergeant's mess. And after about 17, 18, 19 years, they become warrant officers, and they become the sergeant majors of the companies and the battalions, the regiments, fighting the campaign. They are the strength of the British Army. That's not to discount the importance of officers or operational level commanders commanding the brigades and so on. They are important, of course. The Russians don't have the equivalent of that. To be honest, I don't know what the Chinese situation is in the equivalent, but ultimately it does come down to leadership. And that leadership has to understand what is being tried to achieve, has to have the confidence and the understanding of what this is all about, and believe in it, actually. And I don't know what the Chinese army would be like, or indeed their Air Force and Navy would be like, in a shooting war where they were taking lots of casualties in order to secure Taiwan. I mean, at the end of the day, Taiwan is a tiny place. Why do they want it? It's basically an emotional issue, isn't it? So whether the whole of the Chinese people really feel that strongly about it and are prepared to take large casualties in order to secure it, my instinct is I doubt it, but I don't know, is the answer.
My final question to you, Tim. There was a really brilliant point raised by our political editor, Kate McCann, and she was talking about how there's a lot of discussion about Joe Biden's age, and a lot of people say, he's much too old for the job, and they kind of, they make fun of him for it. And she actually said that in the international community, Downing Street in particular, really see that in some ways as an advantage, because Joe Biden's actually known Xi Jinping for 20 odd years. And, what he's able to offer in terms of global politics, international politics, and relations is extremely useful to people like Rishi Sunak, who are much, much younger. How pivotal do you think that Joe Biden will be with that in mind in this conflict? And what do you think will happen if he doesn't win the next election?
Well, the first thing to say, of course, is it is extraordinary that in a nation the size and shape of the USA, we're talking about Biden versus Trump again. I mean, just unbelievable, really. Now, that said, what you're talking about here is wisdom. And the Chinese understand wisdom. They understand experience. And it's not just, just basic knowledge. It's when you're looking at developing things, you need to gather data to turn that into information. And you then need to turn that into knowledge and understanding of what that information and data is telling you. And that enables you to make decisions. And we in the West, again, I've got to be careful what I say here because I don't want to be dismissive of everybody, but we have had a whole series of leaders who are young. I mean, with very little political experience. You look back to David Cameron and even Tony Blair and others. I mean, some of them grew into the job, but nonetheless, they're young people. Now, sorry, let's just wait for this phone to stop ringing. That's okay. We're young people. Biden has got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom. So I'm absolutely with that. That said, he's not a young man anymore. And if he was to get re-elected over the next 4 years, who would then, what could happen? Well, clearly he could die. And who would then take over? Well, there's an issue there about his vice president, who probably we don't want to talk about, but I haven't got an awful lot of time for, if I'm honest. So there's an issue there. So who does Biden gather around him if he is going to be re-elected as president? How does he use his advisors? How does he use them to gather that data and that information to understand what's going on with China and Taiwan? And how does he then interpret that with the wisdom to say, okay, this is how we must now respond? And I have no doubt, I have no problem at all. I would say this because I'm over 70, but I have no problem at all that age carries with it a really strong beneficial aspect to this. But there does come a point when actually that age does begin to detract and turn against you. And I don't know where Biden stands on that. I mean, the press, of course, love, catching him out and showing him when he's misspeaks and all that other stuff. But he's no idiot, and I've got a lot of time for him. I don't actually agree with quite a lot of his politics, if I'm honest. But nonetheless, I'd rather have him than Trump. So if it's a choice between the two of them, that's my call.